Before I type anything, here's the most important rule. AI does not know our dataset unless we define it. Fortunately, Survey Fluency is capable of reading metadata that tells your co-pilot the meaning behind the columns. Our job is to remove ambiguity where possible, giving it a stronger framework for success. That means define the dataset columns, ID the variables of interest, define the task to accomplish, and define the output format for our final results. Of course, Survey Fluency already uses metadata from SAV files to come up with some helpful suggestions on what we want to find out. However, it's helpful to write these in playing mode so you always have a strong North Star to continuously guide you and Survey Fluency to make impactful analysis. Let's look at how Survey Fluency responds to these different prompts. For this one, I'm just going to start basic. Tell me what's interesting about this data. As you can see, Survey Fluency still has a decent grasp about what should be done with this data despite my vague prompt. It provides an overview on the survey data, shows the listed variables, provides metadata that gives an explanation as to what we're looking at here, provides crosstabs that it created along with the Python code to reproduce those. Same thing with a graph that answers the question about dancing behavior versus the training type in our data set. And it answers the question I had, which was what was interesting about this data, providing insights on the effect size, where the design could be improved, or what was interesting about the design imbalance, observed versus expected impacts and frequencies, and telling us more about the data set, along with its statistical significance. With the big question just being, what exactly is being trained to dance? This is good, but I think that we can do better. In this next part of the instruction series, we're going to be talking about context and how that can be used to improve our prompting. Now, let's talk about context. Providing context helps the AI reason more effectively. When we decide and define the decision being supported, the role, and the goal of our analysis, we reduce incorrect assumptions and improve relevance in our analysis. Survey Fluency performs best when it understands who is doing this analysis, who it is for, what problem is being solved, and what success looks like at the end. As an example, I'm going to define the role and context of our analysis by prompting it with this. I'm going to tell it, I'm a survey analyst that is consulting for a pet company that's trying to figure out which training technique they should keep in their standard materials. Can you help me come up with 4 graphs and a presentation that will help us advise them on training materials? And please provide images of every graph and slide in the chat. As you can see, the result is much better. For starters, we get the graphs that we asked for. We got the slides that we asked for, including the previews, along with the corresponding code in case we want to repeat it. And, of course, everything is downloadable here towards the bottom. And, of course, we still have a breakdown of everything we've seen here in text in case we were too busy to actually see anything visually inspected. But so far, a pretty great result. This just shows us the more context you provide, the more targeted your output will be. Now let's briefly talk about how specific we should be with our request and refining them. You could probably tell that some of the graphs were a bit similar, but that's on me. Remember, the more specific we are with a request, the better result we get. It is best to put some parameters on what we want Survey Fluency to help with, so let me clearly define the task. Tasks should include things like output format, the type of analysis you might want to employ, or what techniques you want to use when you're creating your report. In this example, I'm going to set out a little format. As you can see, I specified the weighting, the significance threshold, the substantive difference threshold, the format and tone that we want to use in analysis. And we got something much more specific and much more usable for our clients. It provided a chi-square test of independence, showing the chi-square statistic to be 24.28 with a single degree of freedom and a p-value that is well within our significance test threshold. There are no differences that exceed 10 percentage point threshold, which is important to know, and so it answered that question. We got 3 neutral research insights that anybody within this industry would want to use, and ultimately something that would be useful for a client. Taking a more direct approach with what you want out of survey fluency in general will get us better results. Speaking of results, let's find some further ways to refine our outputs and get something better. Once results are generated, we do not accept them just on first glance. I check, did it clearly use weights? Did it specify the statistical test? Do the results seem plausible? Is it claiming significance without transparency? If anything is unclear or seems off, I can download a result in the chat and use our critical eye to review and refine the prompt. We can also switch it to critique mode and ask questions like, explain the reasoning behind its interpretations, stating any assumptions made during analysis. Asking questions like this makes outputs easier to verify and improves trust in results that we can log in our notebook. For example, I can go ahead and ask while it's in critique mode, please specify the statistical test, include test statistics, degrees of freedom, and p-value. If assumptions are violated, please clearly state that. Refinement is normal. Good prompting is iterative. It can also suggest new directions we might not have considered. Even if we get it right, it may not hurt to repeat the prompt. According to one Cornell paper, actually repeating the prompt improves performance across most agent LLMs. Exploratory analysis is a fundamental part of the process that gives us an initial direction and the opportunity to use the agent for suggesting analytical angles we may not have seen before. We can start simple like I did here and just ask something like, based on this data set, identify which differences in training techniques are most likely to show meaningful variations in result. Update my plan section accordingly. And as you can see over here, we've already done this. We have our plan section that shows exactly how we want to conduct this research, and Survey Fluency has already taken the opportunity to update that with all the information that I've requested before. Since it's given us several options on how we want to proceed, we can then update that plan. It doesn't replace our judgment, but it does help us surface hypotheses faster and keep track of our thoughts. That's essentially why we always plan. You can also ask the AI to suggest multiple approaches. As you can see when I scroll down here, I asked for 3. I said, identify 3 possible analytical strategies for studying the relationship between training and dance. Explain the strengths and limitations of each and update the plan section accordingly. And as you can see over here, it did so. It provided us 3 methods. It's updating the plan. It gives us key updates. And this is a much better way for us to formulate a research plan. The agent can suggest techniques that we might not have considered, and to give us a few options, so that way we always have something meaningful to bring up in meetings. The 3 techniques are here, and our plan section is updated accordingly. Some things that it suggests, for example, are using a chi-square test. That's a really standard way for us to know whether or not what we're looking at is worth delving deeper into. It's also very well understood and easy to interpret. And in fact, the planning section does put down a little table for us to even compare the strengths and weaknesses of each and every method, which is a very useful way of explaining that to clients. Overall, the agent is a partner that you can bounce ideas off of and then update your plan accordingly. Now that we understand the importance of context, defining success, and using the AI to explore our data sets, let's make this replicable. Here is a simple framework I've posted in the chat to help us understand a nice template that we can use for other outputs. So there are a few things that we want to always keep in mind when we're having a prompt or a template for this for future repetition. One is the role. Who is this for, and who is doing the analysis? This is something that we talked about before when we talked about the importance of context. Same thing with the context. What are important details that are needed to answer this question? What questions need to be answered? A description of the data set. If you have metadata, then likely the dataset will already have this information. But if you're uploading a CSV, make sure that you add important information into Survey Fluency that lets it understand what the meaning behind the columns is. Also, let's focus on variables. We want to make sure that we focus our analysis on the right columns to make sure we're answering the right questions. Of course, the other thing that we want to add is the task. We want to define the outputs that we need, and we want to regularly define what is a successful result to the AI agent, since that's how it operates. We also want statistical requirements, so we want to ID the threshold that we need for a specific decision, and we want to also try to guide what techniques we want to prefer and which ones we want to avoid. We also want to put in the output format, specify things like whether we want a CSV, docs, PowerPoints, any visualizations, and make sure to include whether we want those downloadable in chat. Usually, I'd say that we do. And finally, we want to define the constraints. What limitations and constraints should we be putting down on the agent to make sure that it doesn't go into a territory that is unhelpful to us? This is simply a culmination of all the advice we've added here, put into one simple template, something Survey Fluency excels at handling. So if you consistently use this structure, your outputs will be cleaner, safer, and more reliable. In this example dataset, I have added some information in my own template that I think will also help us understand how this works. In the role, I specified that we are a survey statistician and a behavioral research analyst supporting a business decision. The context being that it's for a pet training company trying to determine which method they should be including when they provide training manuals or provide any sort of help to people that are trying to get a result out of their pet. In the dataset description, I said that the study measures the relationship between training method and whether participants danced along with the observed and expected frequency for those outcomes. I also listed out the variables, which we can also see here on the column meaning, and I focused the analysis on training and dance outcomes using observed and expected values. I included a task section, which specified that we want to analyze the relationship between training and dance and compare observed and expected frequencies in the training groups. I also stated that we want to make sure that we have graphs that we can put into a PowerPoint that show meaningful trends, and we want to make sure these PowerPoints are client ready with explanations for each visualization with a summary explanation on how to process that information and how to move forward. I included statistical requirements, like for example, evaluating the difference between observed and expected values, identifying meaningful deviations from expected patterns, avoiding causal claims unless we can find evidence that strongly supports that, and clearly stating our statistical reasoning. Very similar to some of the prompts we've already used in the past. Additionally, I also put an output format that just asks for a table, 3 bullet points, 1 paragraph, and some constraints, like using neutral language, not inventing or doing anything with the data that we would not consent to, clearly stating uncertainty where it's appropriate, and basing our conclusions on the provided variables. Iterating on formats like this allows us to streamline our analysis and get back to the deeper questions we as analysts might be thinking about. And as you can see, it produced a pretty good result. It gives us Python code that we can always use if we want to replicate this, along with a summary table, some key research insights that we've talked about before, plain language interpretations for the business decision maker, along with all of the downloads that we would need in order to make a stellar and convincing PowerPoint presentation to help our clients. Now, let's talk about safeguards and best practices to make sure that we're always making the right decision and not risking anything that we wouldn't be willing to risk. Identifying the right safeguards for productively using AI is an important, evolving conversation. However, there are 3 essential rules I follow when using AI for survey analysis, or any kind of data analysis. 1 is that I never upload personally identifiable information. 2, I never trust a calculated statistic without verification. This is why we have the notebook and why we can copy the Python code. It gives us a way of replicating the data and showing to our clients the exact way that we reached our conclusion. And it makes it reproducible. 3 is always document the prompt used in your analysis. File using your notebook to keep track. Exactly why Survey Fluency is designed the way it is. AI is a drafting assistant. It is not authoritative. It is not a statistical engine that we should base our decisions on completely without using a human eye first. Humans are ultimately the last decision maker when it comes to how we use data. Survey Fluency is merely a tool to make that process more efficient. In addition to defining the task, we need to specify constraints, like not including respondent IDs, avoiding specific tests or regression techniques that we don't trust, and explaining assumptions clearly. Providing those constraints allows for a productive and useful way of using the AI agent without risking getting anything wrong in the process. In closing, AI cannot replace organic human analysis. It is a powerful tool, though. Devising a research process, exploring data, and synthesizing reports can be often repetitive parts of the process that Survey Fluency can help speed up and help you get to the deeper parts of the data and answer questions that might be more time intensive and require a greater critical lens. Prompting is merely structured communication, and the templates we discussed are one of many successful ways to analyze more effectively and efficiently. Ultimately, the quality of the output is directly tied to the quality and clarity of our prompting and instruction. When we treat it that way, it becomes a powerful tool and a great way to help our clients. And with that, have a great day.